Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the session on the future. It is quite a bold statement, and I like it. I like to be a little bit provocative. It's going to be an intense session. I have lots of ideas, lots of concepts, lots of things, lots of code that I want to cram into a fairly short amount of time, but it's going to be fun. I have two intentions of this session. The first one is to talk about the future and how we think about the future at our company and what we do to put that into practice. One of the reasons is for you to know and for you to learn about them so that you could apply those skills and that knowledge into your own projects. But the second reason that ties in very well with it is about a service that we're putting all of that into. So that we're going to go from a fairly philosophical, fairly idealistic discussion and eventually take that into a more practical sense, meaning we're going to actually code. We're going to code quite a lot. I have many different languages that I like to cram into this, and it's going to go fast. So I might do a couple of checkouts throughout the session to see how you're doing, see if you're following me. But if anything, I'll keep my Twitter handle throughout the session. So if there's anything that you'd like to ask, anything that you'd like me to elaborate upon, please go out and reach me. I'll be available throughout the conference. If you can't find me, use the Twitter handle and say where you are, and we'll have a coffee and we'll chat about it. My name is Simon Jäger. I work at Microsoft. I have probably the best job in the world where I get to actually help people and spend my day, 100% of my day, working with people like you guys, getting you started with the technology, getting you started with a product or getting a business running, whatever it has to do with. Is that me making that noise? So what I want to do first and foremost is talk a little bit about the why. Why any of this is important. Why any of this is something that we should matter or actually care about. Why does it matter? What it all boils down into is essentially one question. How do we build something unique? Because that's what we're trying to do today. That's what everyone is trying to do today. How do we build something that's new? And it's very, very different from how we built stuff 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I would have been excited about a music streaming service for my phone, and I was. But I'm not excited about that anymore. I need something more, I need something new. And what we do today to achieve that is to look into new areas of insights, into little contextual things, into adding upon the basic functionality to make something that's unique. I'm no longer excited about a music streaming service for my phone. I'm excited about a music streaming service for my phone that's able to get me the next best song that I've ever listened to without me even knowing that it exists. And those are things that we all try to hunt for, that we all try to achieve so that we can create something that's more fun, that has a better experience, that is more easy, that ultimately gets you more dopamine kicks out of using it. So for example, if we look at what are the top applications out there today, and I like to bring up Instagram and Snapchat, and I used to like to bring up Vine, even though it's dead, but it still serves the purpose. These applications you can pull into a bucket and label that as media capturing applications. They're not successful applications because they can capture media. I mean, you have literally hardware buttons on your phone to do that. These apps are successful because they make it more easy, they make it more fun, and ultimately, again, you get more dopamine kicks out of using that app instead of just the built-in functionality. So that sort of ties into what we're going to talk about here, and you'll see throughout the session why it does tie into that. And I love this service that we're going to talk about for this reason. I think we can all agree that no matter how you feel about Microsoft as a company, there's a big chance that you could use something that Microsoft has to further enhance your solution, to find something to create a wow factor, to create a better experience, or just add something somewhere. Because Microsoft has a lot of stuff. If you look at all the things that we're doing as a company, there's a lot of stuff in there that you could probably use. And as long as it's easy for you to just add that onto your service or whatever you're building, maybe that's just something that you could use to just make it better and ultimately gain more users and more customers or whatever you're seeking to get out of your solution. So let's just plow through this philosophical piece of, all right, what is the future then? How do we think about building APIs? Well, for us, building APIs and the future of APIs is not just about the APIs themselves. APIs are very mature in how we build them and how we collaborate throughout using them and consuming them. But there are many pieces around that that make up the experience, your experience, of consuming an API. That's security. That's SDKs, and all of those things that go around it. And one of these things is obviously OAuth. OAuth as an authentication protocol that we try to use everywhere. And again, it's nothing that's Microsoft specific in any way. I mean, we're all sort of embracing that. In my world, in my job, that's all I do. I only focus or invest in OAuth as an authentication protocol because my job is to make you succeed and build new cool things and just have products and solutions created that are unique and fun. And in that world, OAuth is the only one I'm investing in. But it lays the foundation for new things, for your ability to finely tune what you're building so that you can get and squeeze a few more users, a few more customers out of what you're building. And those are things like incremental consent, which is this notion of making the choice. Let's say you have your solution and you want a user to sign into that. You may or may not want to read that user profile. Maybe it's okay for you to actually give up that right in order to get one new customer. Maybe it isn't, but incremental consent is about giving you that choice, making you able to finely tune what am I willing to give up for more customers and what is something that I absolutely must have. Converged authentication, we're going to talk about this one. It's about the notion that we have multiple identity providers, and what do we do with that? How do we make it so that you as developers can actually build for multiple identity providers and have a single set of maintainable code? Because if you were to do that for every single identity provider, that's going to scale up in terms of what you have to handle and what you have to maintain. But I think you can all agree that I want everyone. I don't care where you're from. But can I converge that from a developer perspective? That's beautiful. And the last one is sort of a prerequisite of everything else. Devices are connected. That's an assumption that we are now making, and that puts a different stage for us in how we actually implement security. Without assuming that devices are connected, none of the other things is actually working. And we're going to dwell into all of these things with code and practical activities, so don't worry. SDKs is also a big part of, how do you consume an API? The reason why SDKs are important is because of the hide-and-seek champion, which is the semicolon, and the one that you forgot that you spent 5 hours trying to debug and find essentially. That's the reason why we need SDKs. We need them to be maintainable. They increase productivity. But we're going to cover cases where we don't have SDKs. What if you don't? So how do you deal with that, and how do we approach this notion of the Microsoft Graph and all this stuff? So the first piece of SDKs is about being decoupled. We have so many different things that you can be building. I'm sure all of you guys are building different things and having different approaches as to what you can do and what you can't do in terms of what your platform is, in terms of what your environment is for your end users. So we need SDKs first and foremost to be able to be decoupled. I need to integrate SDKs so that I can build a pipeline for the perfect scenario that's for me and my solution. The other one is multiple platforms. How do we support that? The result of acknowledging multiple platforms is consistent primitives, meaning how do I make an SDK so that I can use it once and know how to use it anywhere else without destroying the flavor of the language. And the last piece is templating, meaning how do I template SDKs rather than code SDKs, which is sort of how we can go on about creating the consistent primitives notion. And we're all going to see this. I'm going to show you all of this stuff. So all of those ideas, how to show that in a very good way is to show the Microsoft Graph and show you what the Microsoft Graph is, how you can use that. The Microsoft Graph is your endpoint, your single endpoint for anything that you want from the Microsoft Cloud? Is there anything out there that you feel that could contribute to my solution? Anything that I can take advantage of? It doesn't have to be something that costs something or is grand in any way. Maybe it's just a little thing. The Microsoft Graph is going to be your single endpoint. It's going to be your go-to place. So how do you do that? No matter where you are, no matter what you're building, what your programming language is. Well, there are 3 different steps. And I know you're all smart people, so it's going to be easy for you. But there's one thing here that I need to mention. The first one is that, yeah, you're going to learn it, and I'll show you how to do that. You're going to go into the graph, the Microsoft Graph page, and you're going to list and see all the different things you can pull out of it. It's more than you can think of. And just going to find what is it that you want. Maybe I'm just interested in getting what is Microsoft's view on who is relevant for that person. What if I could just take that knowledge and take that into my application and get it for free? So that I could create cool experience where you, for example, you wanted to share something and I could just have the insights of who is important to this person. What if I could just show that as a list and create like a wow factor? And that's your application. The second one is authentication. That's the reason I keep my job. That's where people struggle. So we're going to cover some ground here and how to establish that. Because it's different. It's different, and it's very different depending on what you're doing. Depending on what you're building, what your abilities, on what you can do in terms of what the platform has for features, it's going to be different. And the last one is going to be calling the APIs, or calling the API rather. And it's going to be dead simple. Just to show some of that off, this is this is a graph. So you need to envision this as a graph. And there's a reason why large corporations now all want a graph. Because a very good way of illustrating and visualizing all the things that you have in a specific place or multiple places. And if you look at the hierarchy or how the endpoints are structured, it's simple, it's logical. You got graphmicrosoft.com, you add a branch to it. We're going to talk about what the branch is as a version. And then you pick a place to start off, your starting place. It's a node, right? It's a graph. Where do you want to start off? Maybe that's an entire collection. Maybe that's a specific entity, and that entity could be that /me. That could be like a starting point for who am I and what can I go to. And as you look at what the different things that you can do here, you may notice how many different places you can actually go. And if you realize what's happening underneath, that's pretty awesome, actually. Because there's nothing that you couldn't do before, but you wouldn't. Because you're smart and you're sane people. And that would be very time-consuming to do. So how to do that? Calling APIs. Straightforward. You're familiar with the HTTP verbs. You pick a branch, a version. We're going to talk about what that is. And then you pick your starting point. Where am I going to start off? Maybe it's all the users of an Office 365 account. Maybe it's all the groups or the devices that exist in this particular graph. Maybe it's an entity. Maybe it's a property of that entity. And maybe it's a navigation property so that you can go to some other node. Or maybe you want to apply and be responsible about that data. Actually pick out what are the pieces and things that you need when dealing with this and working with this. So let's get into the real world. I want to demo a few things here. They aren't code related, but I want to show them off for you so that you know sort of where to go if I were to start off with this. So first and foremost, I'm going to try to zoom in here. Your starting point is developermicrosoft.com/graph if you want to engage with any of this. This is your hub for anything. You can also reach this from graphmicrosoft.io, but in here you've got the documentation. And this is where I'd like you to go when you decide to do this. And scroll down and you can actually expand these branches, or the version 1 is expanded by default, but you can expand the beta branch as well. And you can list and see the different things that you can do. And this is where I want you to go and do in order to learn and see what is it that I could use in my solution. What could I have in here that could improve or add value to what I'm doing? The other one is, once you've done that, go ahead and go to the Graph Explorer. This is a brilliant tool to just try that query, to try and see what you can get out of that. without having to set up anything. So what you'll do is just pick out the branch, which one do I want to work with, and then just type in the URL. And I'm using the me node at this point, and I just hit enter and I executed that, and you can see how does that look? What is that type of response? What can I expect? This is a little grainy probably, but what can I expect from doing that? And you can try out all of these features before you start actually implementing them and having them put into your own solution. The other thing is about authentication. Now, when you want to do that, before you start implementing, go and register your application. This is a requirement for using this. And it's nothing more than essentially saying, what's the name of my app? And when doing that, you're going to get a client ID and a client secret, and you can specify a redirect URL. These are the 3 different components you're going to need depending on what you're building, what you're doing. And that's what we're going to see. And for anyone who's actually maybe have done this or done this in Azure Active Directory or something like that before, that's the same thing. What I'm doing here is doing the same thing as registering an application in Azure Active Directory. The difference of doing it in here, of doing it at identity.microsoft.com, is that we're converging authentication. Doing it at this place allows you to talk to the 2 big identity providers from Microsoft, which is Microsoft Accounts, so I can sign in with Outlook or Live, or all of those. And the other one in Azure Active Directory is Office 365. But this guy at identity.microsoft.com converges all of those into a single place. The only thing to know about this thing is that those pieces, those SDKs are a preview, so may not want to use that for mission-critical stuff. So what I've done throughout this session is I've registered in Azure Active Directory already, and I've got essentially my client ID and a password, and I've just put those into a notepad that I'm going to copy and paste from. And we can just sort of ran through a few more slides. And then we'll just spend the rest of the time with code. So SDKs, use SDKs. They're probably going to be available for you. It's going to make everything easy for you. I'm going to show you how to do SDKs, how to not do it with SDKs, and you're going to get a good picture of what all of this is. I need to touch a little bit upon authentication, because that is the tricky part. Using the Microsoft Graph and calling an API, you know how to do that. That's easy. So we're going to spend 2-3 minutes just on this thing. The reason why this is tricky is because we can have different objectives of doing this. Like if you're building or working with a Facebook app, you'll probably be familiar with posting on that person's wall. And that's the first scenario here. Are we doing something on behalf of a user? And if we're doing something on behalf of a user, how does that change how I perform security and authentication and what I can do? Or do I want to create a headless solution, a server-side solution that's just doing something in the background? What that means is that I can't show UI anymore, right? I can't have a user sign into a headless solution because there's no one there. So how do we establish security at that point? And how does that change what I need to put in here? So I've drawn a little picture of how we can think about this in a broad scope. You think about your application, what you're building, no matter what you're building. This could be server-side, it could be whatever programming language whatsoever. We'll ideally talk through a library. We can do bare-bone network requests as well, not a problem. In this case, I put up Microsoft Authentication Library. We're going to use ADOL in a couple of these samples, which is Active Directory Authentication Library. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter, however, you get and establish the OAuth flow. But the only thing I can recommend is that you actually use an SDK for it. So you're going to talk through that. In this case, we need to talk through the Microsoft Identity or Identity Provider. And that's going to get us potentially three different things. Again, different depending on what you're building. You're going to have different things. We're going to have an ID token, an access token, a refresh token. ID token sort of represents who you are. An access token is an access, sort of a privilege to a service. A refresh token is how you kind of keep that alive. The reason we do that in OAuth, it's really nothing that's established or decided by Microsoft as a company. You know, that's an open standard. That's sort of how we look at security going forward. We use refresh tokens, access tokens. Their security sort of lies in the short lifespan of it. and then you use a refresh token to refresh it, what that does is that it forces your solution to constantly check. Constantly check, can I still do this? It allows the server side, the identity provider, to always ensure I can still do this. And that's how we talk to the service later on. We don't talk with username and passwords anymore. It's not okay to send username and passwords over network requests anymore. So what we're going to spend now, finally, the rest of the time in, is coding. So let me bring up those identifiers that I had. That client ID and a client secret. I also registered 2 different applications. Now, doing it in this guy, in the identity@microsoft.com, allows you to do all of that into a single application, meaning you can add platforms into one of them. Whereas if you're doing it in Azure Active Directory, you have to create two different apps, essentially, one for the web and one for the native. The reason being that you get different things from whatever you're building, and we're going to see what that is. So I thought we'd start off in, can everyone read this, by the way? Should I enlarge it? It's all good, by the way. All right, so we'll start off in sort of my home turf, C#. We'll have the scenario. We have everything available. We have all the SDKs we need. We have ADOL. We have a Microsoft Graph SDK. It's .NET. We got everything. So how can we start doing it? How can we use it? How simple is it? And then we're going to venture into the case of, what if I don't have anything? So the only thing I've done here, it's clean. I created a new console application. I added the Active Directory authentication library and the Microsoft Graph SDK. I searched for them and just installed them ahead, so we don't have to rely on any network connectivity. And so let's go ahead and actually do as said here in the comment. Let's implement this stuff. So the only thing I did here was obviously to wait for that async operation. So the first thing we need to do is to bring those identifiers in here. And I've got this one for the native solution. And we'll just bring it in. And it's not going to be pretty code. I hope you can bear with me. And the other one that we got from a native application is a redirect URI. The reason being that a native solution is something we trust more. So we don't get a client secret. We don't really need it. We trust that you run, when you run in the native solution, that it's not like, for instance, JavaScript, where we can just peek in there and get something out of it. So at this point, I brought this stuff in here. And now what we do is to create an authentication context, which is something that comes from ADOL, the Active Directory authentication library. And then we bring in an authority, which is essentially who's going to authenticate this user. Who is responsible for doing it? And now, because I created it in Azure Active Directory, I created it in my directory that I have. I need to specify, or I can specify, my own directory. And that's the identifier for all my directories. So my own directory is going to authenticate this. But if I build a multi-tenant solution or something like that, I can use the common endpoint, which is just like a big authority that can essentially authenticate anything. It doesn't really matter. And what we do next up is just to get a result from this. So we will await a function or a method on the context, which is named acquire token. Next up, we'll say, all right, what are you trying to acquire a token for? Well, in this case, it's very straightforward. It's the Microsoft Graph. And next up, you will see we have multiple overrides in here. And that's because we can do this in many different ways. I can bring in my client ID. I'll pick this version. And I had that redirect URI. Whoops. Put it in. And we'll then specify platform parameters. And those simply allow us to just say, in this case, I'll just always have it prompting. Always have the user sign in. Don't store anything in a cache or whatever, so that we can just see what's going to happen here. So what we'll do here now is to create the Graph client. Create the service client, which is in the Microsoft Graph SDK. The way that we do that is like such. We created an Indian constructor. We can provide what's called an authentication provider. And that's the way that we bring in the result from adult, because these libraries don't know about each other. They have no clue what each and every SDK here is doing. So this is about how do we make these guys work together? How do I incorporate the result here? Because the graph client can no longer assume how you establish security. How did you make this happen? Did you get it from ADOL? Did you get it from MSAL? Did you get it from another library? Did you do network requests to establish this? We don't know, so therefore the graph client or the Microsoft Graph SDK can't assume it, and instead allows you to just, hey, bring in your result and do what needs to happen, which is get it on the request. So the delegate authentication provider here is just throwing a request at you, and it's saying, this is what I'm going to send. Do you want to do something with it? You probably do. And what you want to do is essentially to get the authorization header set and add the result from the authentication result. You'd probably do this better if you did it for mission critical stuff and production stuff. But this is just showing how you could do it and illustrating how it works. So at this point, we've merged them together. They know how to work with each other, sort of. At least we're piping in the results. So we're pretty much ready to go here. So what we can do is just the following. We can get a user, get myself. I can use that me node. And what you see once I've navigated through that, I'll create a request out of it and then pull off the get function. Because I can do a lot of stuff on this. I can update myself and work with it, but in this case, we're just interested in ourselves and getting that data. So let's just print it and just pray that it works. Live coding is never a good idea. And with that, you'll see that, all right, it's popping open a window, having me sign in. I'll sign in with an account that belonged to that Azure AD, because I picked out that Azure AD precisely. And, oh, darn it. Did anyone see that it actually spelled out my name? Yeah. Do you believe me if we continue and I don't sign in again? Yeah. Can you check with my password, please? No, we'll continue instead. So in this case, everything is all in web. I had all the SDKs. I mean, for me, I'm in a very familiar world. I have the ability to show a user interface for my user and have them, go at it and just sign in and use their password. What's cool is that it doesn't have to be a password either. I mean, my IT administrator could have said, you need to sign in with a letter that comes in the mail, and you need to sign in with a phone code and everything. That's all fine. That's abstracted away by using these libraries and using those endpoints. So let's put ourselves in, at least put me in a very different world. Let's say we're building a backend. We don't have the ability to do this in a front end. We don't have anything that we can show. So I want to do this in Ruby, and we'll create a new file. And it's going to be fairly simple. And this is what I want to illustrate by doing it in Ruby. But we still have the same ability to use SDKs and libraries in here. But I'm going to showcase that the concept of those consistent primitives in this case. So what I'm going to do is just get those SDKs in here. And as before, we need to bring in those identifiers. And in this case, I'm going to build, it's a web solution instead. Can you see this? Cool. So I'll bring in that secret. And I'm going to have these secrets re-rolled after the session. So don't even try. I think we can be happy at this point, actually. Yes. So what we want to do now is essentially we can combine those into a single object. You can do this if you did it in C# as well. It doesn't matter. It's all going to be the same, but I can't illustrate that idea of consistent primitives at this point. But what we do is to create a what's called a client credential object. And that just essentially merges the ID and the secret into a single object that we'll use. secret. And from now on, we can create an authentication context again. So we'll just call that a context, authentication context, and we'll fix any mistakes when we try to run it. And in here, if you remember, we needed to specify the authority. What's the authority? Who's going to authenticate this request? And in Ruby, we do have a little helper that we can bring in to not spell the HTTPS login.microsoftonline.com. So we can specify it using this authority. And then we can I'll bring in the same guy again, my own directory. And we'll try to wrap this. And then we can just go ahead and get a result from this again. And that we use the context, and then this time we call a function which is called acquired token for client, I think. We'll see if it works or not. And when doing so, we need to first and foremost specify, all right, what are you trying to acquire your token for? Again, this is going to be the graph. And next up, we'll just specify, all right, what can you give me here? Like, what are the credentials that you can give me at this point? And let's see if we get something out of this. Access token. If not, we'll fix that. Oh. That looks like an access token. So at this point, we got an access token without showing UI. And now at this point, we can start doing those things that we did. And we can start using the Microsoft Graph. But again, the Microsoft Graph still doesn't know, how did I acquire that security? How do I acquire those tokens, essentially? So what I'll do is to instantiate, or actually, first and foremost, create that callback that we can use to link these guys together. So we'll define a callback, and we'll use the following syntax. And then in the sort of same way, we bring in what's called or bring in the request, rather. Headers. And what we need to do is to modify the authorization header. And we need to set that, or use the result, essentially. Result access token. So now let's use that in the when creating that client. So what we do is instantiate it, Microsoft. I can't spell. And in here, we need a parameter that we're going to define, which is a particular parameter what we need only in this case when we're doing it and building it for Ruby. You're going to find a few different things depending on the platforms that are going to be a little bit different. But as a whole, you're going to be familiar with whatever platform you're at. So in this case, we need a metadata file path, and I'll explain what this is. Essentially, in short terms, this is just a place where the SDK can store the metadata that it can pull from the graph, which essentially just describes the object model for the graph. And it's just something that we need to provide. So this is the property itself is called cached metadata file, metadata file path. Well, let's see if we probably have a couple of spelling mistakes in here, but we'll fix those as we go. And finally, let's just go ahead and do something else. We'll grab all the users this time instead. We'll use the graph client, and it will print all of that out. So users each, user puts user. We can use the same name, same thing, same parameter, and I'll point to it as we get it to work. Yeah, there probably is. Where is it? Thank you. I thought we would have more typists before we could run this guy. All right. this time it won't go away on me, but that's printing all of the users that I have in that in the directory that I'm actually querying. So what's happening here, and what you'll see is that it's sort of the same idea again. Properties and all of that, that's going to have the same name wherever you are. That's totally at the bottom. And it doesn't matter what platform you're coding for. If you don't at one place, you'll know what's the property going to be named in a different place without destroying what the flavor is for that platform. In Ruby, I expect properties to be named like this. I expect the underscore. But in C#, I don't. Instead, in C#, I would expect the async keyword on the function method. And then we have different approaches depending on or different conventions, rather, depending on the language. But you'll still kind of know what to look for and how to do that. So let's go a little crazy in this case and just say we don't have anything at this point. The first thing I want to do is just to copy this piece because I think you'll understand ADOL at this point. So ADOL itself, as a library, as SDK, no matter what you're building, you probably have the SDK. It's available practically for anything. It's been around for a while, so they've had a lot of time to build it and have it available everywhere. The Microsoft Graph SDK is not yet, though. They're adding as we go, and there's exciting things coming to that in the future, but there's a chance that there isn't an SDK for what you're doing. So in that case, we'll look at how you would do this in that case when we don't have anything. But we'll assume that we have this available already for a different language, ADOL that is. So let's do this in Go. This should be a little crazy. So let's just put up the basic structure, and we're not going to assume any SDKs in this case. FMT, we don't do that. IO util, and let's have a main function. And we get into the right directory, and let's say we just figured out how to get the access token. We used ADOL, we used another library for doing it that we think do it better, or whatever you want. Let's just assume we have this. So now we should go ahead and create a client, an HTTP client. And to do that, we'll do the following. We're going to do bare bone network requests at this point. So let's go ahead and create the request. Actually, we get an error back that we don't care about. New request, and we'll specify what are we going to do. We're going to do a get, all right? And let's do something a bit more exciting as well at this point than just querying data or collections or entities. So let's do this for, let's get an insight. Let's get something smart. Let's get something that's a little bit more exciting. Let me just wrap all of this. So we'll specify the beta branch. I'll specify users. I'll drill into myself, that user that I signed into, Microsoft.com, and I do /people. And once we successfully do that, I'll show you what that's going to bring me. I'm not sure if this actually works with the apostrophe, so I'll just switch that. But this is just making a bare bone request. So what was that thing that we needed to do to make this happen? Well, that was appending or working with the headers, essentially, to append the access token to it. So header set, we want to set the authorization header, and we'll add the access token, like so. And then we send the request. From that, we'll get a response and an error that we, again, don't care about. We probably should. And from this point, it's all about parsing that, and in our case, we're just going to assume that everything worked out. So we use that IO utility that we brought in. We'll read everything from the response body, and then we need to actually get that into a string. And we will put that. We should probably do this more nicely and actually work with the response better, but at this point, we just want to see what's happening. Go sample. Right, we get an error from this guy as well. And with that, I got a response. I'm a headless solution. I just pulled in an access token that I got from somewhere. The files and the other different things that are important to me, and you don't have to build that knowledge. You just have to use that, and that allows you to create something more in your solution, create something that actually makes it a bit more exciting, and something that creates more of a wow factor. I do have more code samples that we can drill into, but I think you get the point in a sense. We could show more, but here was this notion of how do you know how to use this once and then know how to use it everywhere? Well, it's about those consistent primitives. It's the idea of the same naming convention for objects and classes and functions and methods, whatever you want to call it. So no matter if I'm writing, for instance, this function that's getting me, then pouring a message into the send function, which is a function that's available on a user. So you can send a mail from that user. And what's so cool here is that, well, what if that user comes from Office 365? That user comes from a Microsoft account. They have different mail services. So if you wanted to do that on your own before the Microsoft Graph, that would mean that you would have to actually program and maintain code for 2 different services. But in this case, you don't even have to care. And again, if you wanted to store a file on the user's cloud storage, you as a developer don't really care if maybe that's OneDrive for consumer, OneDrive for business, maybe that's a SharePoint document library. You don't care. What you want to do is to provide the feature, the functionality to do that, right? You want your app to say, hey, do you want to store this file in your cloud? And just have one way of doing that. So you can have a sneak peek of Objective-C if you're into that stuff. It's practically doing the same, but in a funky way. But with that, I can't go on to other samples. If you want to have a look at them, you can go ahead and tweet me, and I'll send them to you. We have run out of time. I appreciate you coming here, and I hope you found something interesting. I hope that you can use whatever you found today and actually have pointers as to how to get started. You go and you learn it, you figure out the authentications, use the SDKs, and then you call it and explore it with the Graph Explorer and build it into your solution and use what's out there. It's easy, and it allows you to bring more value to whatever you're building, no matter where you're coming from. So thank you.